So, good afternoon, everyone, and sorry for the delay, more than 10 minutes. It's me and Patrizia Popoli welcoming you. Sorry, we had serious connection problem with the Netherlands, with Professor Lefkens. We had twice tried to start, but had to stop because of intermittent line. So. Let me ask you 2-3 minutes more of patience and waiting for a proper start, because we are trying to connect him on the English line only, without video, and have his presentation with the slides. And in case we have problem, it will be translated on the Italian channel. And should be possible, though this is still our best guess. If all fails in a few minutes, we will have probably to give up, but we still hope we can go on. As you know, these AIFA meetings have been extremely successful. Also today, we have more than 1,500 attendees, so from both Italy and Europe and beyond, as from the title of today, quite broad lecture. We hope to hear from Professor Lefkens. So sorry again for this problem. We didn't have them when we had the first trial this morning, and not sure we can successfully have this conference. So we hope so, but maybe I can also stay mute, as I'm not particularly interested in what I'm saying. And thank you, Patrizia, for the support, with a smile. And maybe let's wait a minute or two. If the technicians successfully are able to broadcast on YouTube channel Bert Lefkens, we will have a start in a couple of minutes. If not, let's find another date.
Okay, we're online. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, now we can. So we were waiting to see you. Thank you, Bert. So I would start with optimism. Sorry for the 15 minutes academic delay. At least that's what happens in Italy. Never happens the delay in the Netherlands, where I've been a few times in Utrecht. So I'll give you a short biography and of Professor Lefkens, and why he's giving us today such a broad perspective on medicines regulations and beyond, what happens after products are put into the market. But Lefkens is an important pharmacologist for Europe. He has been a pretty outstanding figure both in academia and regulatory science. He has been very active in his Utrecht University in the last couple or 3 decades. has also been very active at international level, both at EMA headquarters on the Pharmacovigilance Working Party, but he has been for more than 10 years the chair of the Dutch Medicines Evaluation Board. He has also been scientific director of an important, one of the most active WHO collaborating center in regulatory, in pharmaceutical policy and regulation. He has one of the best PhD group active researchers in his university, and I have to say it's a very nice environment, very active, quite multidisciplinary, and open to new ideas and innovation. More recently, Bert was professor of regulatory science and policy at Utrecht University, and is now professor emeritus, has more time for his interest and active international collaboration. I would like to thank Bert for having accepted this, let me say, quite unusual and original rethinking of what we can do, or how best we can use all the evidence that has been gathered before approval and in the years subsequent to approval, and also a reflection on what has happened during this COVID-19 big emergency was a source of inspiration for his presentation. So, Bert, the floor is yours. Thanks again.
Well, thank you, Nicola, and I'm very pleased also for the invitation, and I would like to congratulate also AIFA for this, I think, wonderful initiative of scientific seminars in the context of regulation, and I've witnessed two previous ones, and I think under your leadership it has evolved very nicely, and I think it's very important. May I see the first slide, please, then I can move on. Well, the topic I would like to discuss this afternoon with you, and I understood that there are quite a number of participants here, is how regulatory systems moved over the years. And you may know that these systems, they very often start as a response of the public domain towards a crisis, either a safety issue or something else. And in most countries we know here around Europe, this started about 50, 60 years ago. The EMA, the European Medicines Agency, started in 1995. FDA a little bit earlier, a number of years earlier, but overall, that is where they started. And regulatory systems, they have basically three objectives. First, to ensure patient safety. Very often, that's where it started. To enable public health, and also to stimulate innovation. And the latter is constantly under scrutiny and discussion, because there are groups within society that believe that, stimulating innovation should not be a particular task for regulators. Personally, I disagree with that. I will come back to that later, but that's an interesting feature also, how different views may occur around how regulatory systems are there. The next slide, please. What is important, I think, is to start with some brief reflections on the European system. And I take this summary where you see here the Directive 2001/83 and the Regulation 726/2004. Basically, they are the foundations of many procedures, actions, interventions, the regulatory system in Europe, including, of course, institutions like AIFA, but also in the Netherlands, MIB do. And what you see here is that it highlights very much the marketing authorization as a pivotal task. And the marketing authorization is where you can briefly summarize it as a yes, no decision, plus summary of product characteristics. And the latter is very important because it gives direction to the prescriber. It is also the boundaries of marketing from the companies, and in a way, it's very important also for the interactions with other stakeholders. Well, later on, we see that additional tasks have been added, particularly in the rare diseases and children and advanced therapies, including gene therapy and cell therapy. Well, all these are now under review in the context of the European pharmaceutical strategy. But again, and then I come to the last part of this slide, the authorization is the pivotal hub here, built on 3 criteria named quality, safety, and efficacy. And the question I would like to address here in this seminar is what's going on beyond that authorization task of the regulators? Because when I look at also at AIFA, but also when I look at Paul Ehrlich Institute in Germany or Infamed in Portugal, MIB in the Netherlands, you see that over the years within this European framework, national authorities, national competent authorities have evolved and have put very specific national flavors to that system, very often based also on the local situation, political masters, all kinds of interactions. But the question I would like to raise is what does it mean for the system as such, but also are we now serving patients and public health in a better way? Because that's a question I would like to ask, and not only to ask, but also to answer. The next slide, please. The metaphor I would like to use is a river, and I made this picture myself in 2018 in Japan, where we were traveling there, and the river as a metaphor is, I think, a very interesting model to think about what's happening upstream of the river. And we see there basic science, discovery, research and development, clinical development, manufacturing. That's very often what's happening in academia, within the industry, research institutions. And then we have that magic moment of the authorization, and then we see a lot of activities also more downstream, where we look at the drug use itself, the way the medicines are prescribed, clinical guidelines, the interactions with health technology assessment agencies and reimbursement, the payers, but also pharmacovigilance. And this transition between upstream and downstream is marked by that magic moment. And of course, this is a very oversimplification of reality, because this sounds that, well, usually that the river goes only one direction, and we all know that there are also downstream activities that influence upstream decision-making. For instance, when pharmacovigilance highlights a certain molecular mechanism of a safety issue, then of course the discovery and the clinical development people should listen to that. So it's a forward, backwards, etc. But for the purpose of this talk, I would like to use this metaphor because I think it is useful to organize our thinking. The next slide, please. What you see here is and it's not an exhaustive list, but a listing of a number of upstream activities, scientific advice from the agencies to the company, protocol assistant, scientific guidelines, public consultation of the guidelines, oversight of clinical trials, conditional approval. So all kinds of instruments, procedures, where essentially the regulators enable, but also want to create the best evidence that is possible to make an appropriate and balanced decision about an authorization. When we look at the more downstream activities, we see also a list about appropriate use, clinical guidelines. I know that AIFA is very, very active also in stimulating a good thinking in the clinic, has a lot of interactions also with the clinic, interactions also with HTA and payers, and that is in the case of AIFA more or less integrated. And for instance, in the Netherlands, there are separate organizations, so different member states across Europe have different models for that. But essentially, when the decision is made for marketing authorization, what is next in the space of HTA and payers? And then, of course, also the very topic around input for the vaccine strategy. We see a very interesting feature, and also I think sometimes also with a lot of concerns, where we have different positions of member states within Europe, not always waiting for the decision that has been made is made by the European Medicines Agency. So a lot of discussions about, okay, where is the convergence there, and how can we interpret that in terms of the European system as a whole. And more recently, and that is also part of for the European strategy, we see also management of drug shortages. This list is not complete, it's et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what we see here is two pillars of activities that are not directly related to the market organization, where we see at the left a high level of convergence. We see more and more interactions between member states coordinated by the EMA, and very much also what is the best evidence to create a proper peer decision. Where we see a more downstream, a low level of convergence, where we see different member states, where we see different decisions of HTAs, where we see different guidelines based on the same product information. And the question is, of course, well, that has a reason, because member states have different flavors, different systems, different legal requirements, also different cultures of prescribing. So that's one of the reasons. But as a whole, it raises the question: how can we maintain a certain level of convergence so that there is not a big gap between upstream and downstream? And that brings me to a number of observations I would like to share with you. The next slide, please. First observation is we see more upstream regulatory interventions with downstream impact. And that's of course very logical, because what's happening upstream always has impact on what's happening downstream. But I would like to highlight particular two important features of the current debate within Europe, and I think also across the world, is the regulation of biosimilar. I'm very positive and enthusiastic about the European regulation of biosimilars, and I was part of the discussions when I was at the CHMP of the EMA, and I was also part of quite a number of national discussions about it. But we see still in a number of countries mixed acceptance by prescribers and patients. And the reason is can we understand that, and why is that happening? And the second is conditional approval. That's in the regulation, that at a certain moment the regulators can give an authorization on a condition, for instance, the completion of a certain trial or number of extra tests and so on. And what that means is that more downstream, we see more and more uneasiness at the HCAs and payer to handle that. Well, to flesh it a little bit out, next slide, please. What we see here is a summary of the biosimilar regulations, and I don't go into all the details, but basically the biosimilar assessment in Europe is very much based on comparative critical quality parameters rather than clinical trials. In theory, one could say, well, when all the all the qualitative measures are, comparative in terms of similarity, well, is a clinical trial necessary? And I remember very much when the first biosimilar dossiers were discussed in the CHMP, we had a lot of discussion: is this trial needed? Because very often the trial was small, underpowered, not directed at the right endpoint or the right indication. So we had a lot of discussions about it. But at the moment when the biosimilars came into practice, there was a lot of discussion, I think for good reasons, that doctors and pharmacists and patients asked, okay, you have not evaluated from a clinical perspective, should we trust these products? And we highlighted that in a number of papers. One was in 2012, where we looked at how doctors' organizations in Europe responded to the public consultation when the biosimilar regulation was developed. And actually, our conclusion was very, very, disturbing, because there was virtually no interaction with doctors' organization. They had absolutely no interest at that moment in the biosimilar regulation. But at the moment the biosimilars came into practice, there was a lot of noise and a lot of, I think, also very often for good reasons, questions about the trust and the quality. So here an example where, in my view, upstream interactions with prescribers, with the medical community, would have prevented a lot of downstream disturbance and confusion. Next slide, please. The second example I would like to discuss with you is the conditional marketing authorization procedure. And Jan Hoekman, also from the Utrecht group, with his colleagues, looked at the 10 years of this procedure. There were about 29 decisions made in the context of conditional approval. And what you see here, very often these were the more lengthy discussions. There was a lot of disagreement within the CHMP. There was no consensus. And actually, that is also reflecting what's happening, because very often the company came in with the request for a full license. Then a lot of concerns were expressed, a lot of uncertainties about the evidence, about also concerns about the rigor of the data. And then, very often it ended up in 1 out of 2, it ended up in a conditional approval. Well, this picture, it can be very much understood from a regulatory point of view. But when you look at the HTA environment, you see a lot of concerns in terms of, how should we evaluate these products, given that not all the data are present in the dossier. We follow all these products already in a cohort study over many, many years, and so far, we have not seen any big problems in terms of efficacy or in terms of safety. But that is not the moment the HTA authorities have to make a decision, because very often that's in the year or the second year after the authorization. So here, again, a mismatch, a disconnect between what's happening upstream and what's happening also more downstream the river. And that brings me to the second observation I would like to discuss with you. Next slide, please. There is an increasing convergence and reliance in upstream regulatory policy, and that's good news. That's a compliment to the authorities and the people who work there. The EMA is doing a wonderful job, in my view, to maintain the European system. National Competent Authority do a great job also to contribute in work sharing and standard settings, etc. And on a global level, the European system is seen as a model of reliance and convergence. We see the same also with international collaboration, with ICH, WHO, the ICDRA, the IMRA, and that was already also reflected when the requirements for the new COVID vaccines were published. That was very much international collaboration, alignment between the individual regulatory platforms, to facilitate speedy approval, or speedy review, I should say, of the vaccines. Well, this increasing convergence is something that we should really, put on the top of our priorities, also to maintain that, because that's at the heart of the quality of the European, but also I think also the global system, particularly when it comes also to mutual acceptance of inspections, GMP, and other requirements that are more and more at stake. But there is a big but here, and I go to the next slide here. We see convergence indeed upstream, but what you see here, please the next slide. You see here that there is a lot of discussions about, okay, when you regulate a medicine, what's the definition of the disease? What endpoints are necessary, to evaluate? What is the target population? What kind of comparison? And we see, and that's here in the second column, a huge list of all kinds of challenges, particularly at the moment, of course, the agnostic indications, where we see drugs developed on a mechanism and not on, for instance, an organ or a part of the body, etc. And there's a lot of discussion, not only within the regulatory space, but also in the payers and in the HTA space. The same is true when it comes to endpoints. We see HTA organizations within Europe that don't accept progression-free survival as a relevant endpoint in oncology. I don't want to say progression-free survival is heaven. There's a lot of limitations, but to say no to this endpoint it's quite a challenge. We see the same as biomarkers to identify responders and non-responders. I remember when we introduced the first checkpoint inhibitors, I was very positive about initially to use the biomarker PD-L1, to stratify possible responders and non-responders. And we all know in the field that didn't happen. And that struggle is still not only in the regulatory, the HTA space, but also in the clinic. And of course, finally, what kind of comparison is needed? And we know that, for instance, clinical guideline committees and HTA organizations, they really want to have active control comparisons so that they can evaluate, is this product better than what we already have, and also in the context of the price. And that brings me to the third observation I would like to discuss with you. Next slide, please. There is increasing lack of convergence in downstream policies and decision-making. And I have already highlighted the differences in HTA decision. I'll come back to that later on. You see also that clinical guidelines do not always follow the product information, and very often for good reasons. And sometimes the specific clinical situation asks for instance, a specific contraindication or a specific warning in the pathology section, or a more broader or more narrow indication when it comes to 4.1 of the SMPC. But my point I would like to make, and that is my overall message here, at the moment, the downstream activities, so including the clinical guidelines, go too far away from the SMPC. The question is there, what does the SMPC mean for clinical practice and for the system as a whole? And I hope we can come back to that later on in the discussion. We see the same as the lack of convergence with some of the management of the safety issues in Europe. There are always national, interests or flavors or interpretations at stake. And again, a compliment, I think, to the committees at the EMA, and in particular the PRAC now, but also the CHP, to come at least with a common European view, given that there are not always the same views on the same data or the same issue. For instance, the gadolinium was a typical Danish issue. The valproate is highlighted very much also in France. Cipeprone and estradiol was typical in France and also in the Netherlands. And more recently, the nitrosamines are a very relevant one, where there is a common view now. There was a report by the EMA just a few months ago, where there was I think a very solid framework also to evaluate it. But nitrosamines were found in products that are frequently used also in for instance, in hypertension, and where there is this tension between, okay, when you are too strict on the safety issue, what does it mean, for instance, for production facilities, and also, and then I come back to the next point, the management of drug shortages. And these drug shortages are a very intriguing one when it comes to the role of regulators. I remember when I was chairman of the MRB, we had a dossier that was outdated, and we want to be very tough on the company when they want to update the dossier. So that was good news. And so we thought we'd do a very good job, and be very tough on the company. The company moved the production of that product to another facility. But while we were very strict, the company ran into problems, and at the same moment, the product was not available when it should be available for patients, and we run into a drug shortage. So here again, a balance between, okay, when you are strict and very good, very often for good reasons, what does that mean for the more downstream, in this case, drug shortages and supply? And finally, and that's a very topical one, of course, the national COVID vaccine strategy differ very much between countries and within EMA positions. And I must say that I fully understand why these national positions are there, and I also understand there are a lot of political pressure and pressure of stakeholders on the national level, etc. But to keep a European view, sustainable, that's a heavy task, and I hope we come back to that later on. So that brings me to the next slide, please. A summary of what I said before when it comes to HTA decision making about downstream. What you see here is work from our group. Rick Freeman worked on that, where he looked at conditional approved products until June 2016. And he compared whether there were control data, so randomized data in the dossier compared to uncontrolled data, so historical controls of single arm studies, etc. The hypothesis was there would be a difference. between the two when it comes to the decision making by the HTA organizations. And actually the data, and you can see that here, didn't show that because there were other reasons also to deviate here. But the issue you see here in this slide, a huge difference between the countries that were included, and this study was done before Brexit. So you see England, you see Nice, you see Scotland, a huge difference between the individual countries when it comes to decision making. So the way these organizations weighted the unfinished evidence was very clear. And that is something that's under debate. I know that is also within the sphere of UNETA and other organizations. I hope that we will have a coordinated view on HTA also for the future. That's not only important for the HTA environment, but also very important for the regulatory environment, and at the end of the day, of course, public health and patients. Next slide, please. But this is also leading to the question, and that is a key question when it comes to regulation beyond the authorization from who owns the label. And we all know that there is a lot of fuzz in the label, things that are some in the label where people think, why is this in the label? But at the same moment, there is also a lot of meaningful evidence that's not in the label. And what's in the label is a mixture of evidence building, very much also during the procedure, when the rapporteurs, drive a dossier in the European context. There is a lot of discussions about 4.1 and posology, etc., etc. Well, but then that's not carved in stone because the product is used in practice. We see a lot of new evidence building. We see also a new insight. We saw that the same with COVID. Now just today we saw there was a more relaxed view on the cold chain of one of the vaccines. So that's moving on as we speak. But the question is, what's in the label? And I think the most critical one is here in the 2x3 table, that there is meaningful evidence, but it's not in the label. And I think that's in my view not sustainable for the future. And I know that companies are reluctant to do so, very often also for liability and workload and cost reasons, etc., etc. But if you want to have a label that is as close as possible to clinical practice, the label should be close as possible also to the label. But that means that there should always also be convergence, because if the label is different in Italy compared to Finland or to the Netherlands, then we have another problem. And we see when we look at, for instance, the labels of all products, paracetamol or other products, we see quite some differences there. And the label remains very important. I would like to highlight with a study we just did together with the next slide, please, on antibiotics, where Alexandra Opaska from the European Commission, she's doing a PhD with us in Utrecht, where she looked at the procedures that were taken by the European system. 4 were triggered by member state, 11 were triggered by the European Commission. 15 antibiotics went through this, one of the referral procedures, Article 30 and Article 31. And 13 referrals resulted in deletions of an indication. And these were major antibiotics, also from the view, how can we use the label to combat AMR and also to increase appropriate use. So, Nicola, I would like to stop here for a moment, and Patricia, so that if there are any questions or any reflections, I'm very happy to interact. And I have some follow-up slides more later on, but let's see how it works when it comes to time and the heat of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bert. I would like to suggest that Patricia can conduct the discussion part, and maybe she also has some questions. Maybe we've already received a few. Please, Patricia.
Okay, thank you, Nicola. Thank you very much, Bert. I find this conference very opportune, because really we are facing an increasing complexity in the evaluation of drugs in the post-marketing phase. And you provided so many cues that each of which would deserve a deepened discussion, but of course we have to focus on a few ones. So I would start with your consideration that there is an increasing convergence at upstream level of the river, and then there is a lack of convergence in the downstream level. Of course, as you mentioned, in part such a reduced convergence in the downstream phase could be related to the low level of evidence in some case, because the higher the uncertainty, the higher the variability, and the higher the lack of convergence, of course. And indeed, you showed that drugs approved according to the conditional approval procedure, which are drugs which should address a very urgent unmet need, require longer evaluation times at the DCHMP. So urgent drugs, but we need much more time to evaluate them. And if we look at the national phase, this is even amplified, because when we try to evaluate the drug, to valorize it, there is a great discrepancy between the expectations of the companies and the quite conservative valorization we perform in consideration of the uncertainty and the low level of evidence. So this is a big problem. I would like to have your comment on this. Thank you.
Yes, I think you raise a very, very important point, and on top of that, these are products very often also with very high prices. And that makes the discussion even more complex. I don't think that we should not use the conditional approval procedure anymore. If you now look at the vaccines, they are all conditionally approved, I think, for good reason. So I think as a principle, I think, and there are also very good scientific reasons, because very often the conditional approval is given for indications in the rare disease space, very often also in the rare cancers. And there you can say, well, do another trial, or do another, bigger trial, or etc. I used to ask my assessor teams always, when they come and they say, well, we don't take the data, we want to have another trial, etc. And my standard question was always, okay, let's assume the company will do the trial, and let's assume you have the data in 1 year, 2 years, etc. Do you think you can make a better decision, yes or no? And this was not always the case, because we are working on the edge of what is possible and what is feasible. And there will be always uncertainties. We'll come back to that if we have time later on. I think the complexity here comes limited data set and huge prices, because nobody would say, well, okay, when there is evidence, because in the regulation it said conditional approval is only possible when essentially the benefit risk is positive. So there should be at least a basis of benefit. So some people argue against that, whether that should be in or not. But I think it's a good principle, because if we would lose that principle, then it could be everything. Then it would be trial and error. And I think we should get rid of that. But I don't have a direct solution, but the complexity is also very much driven by the pricing issue and the budget impact from there.
Thank you very much. And speaking of prices, someone from the audience is asking, do you believe that in some cases prices could be set at the European level or not?
Well, I don't think that is feasible. And if you look at the Treaty of Rome and everything that has been said in the European Council, even at the meeting in Porto a few weeks ago, I was very much clear on that. National authorities, they have their own possibilities, economic situations, social systems, etc., etc. What I hope is that there will be more collaboration between countries when it comes to negotiating with the companies, etc., etc. And I see that moving.
Thank you. I fully agree with you. It was a question from the audience, but I fully agree with you. Nicola, have you got any question at this time or not?
I would like to have a comment from Bert that we will probably expand on the next session of his talk on how do you judge, Bert, the huge variability on actions related to the AstraZeneca, in particular, vaccine around Europe that with a common set of evidence that EMA set, in my view, in a very wise way for the community, but then the national authorities or different bodies, as you suggested, because sometimes we're public health bodies or national vaccination committees, took the widest range of decision from no use, Scandinavian mostly, more recently Austria, to just above a certain age, or free to all. So what's your view in all senses, because you taught us how to judge things both ways, positive and negative and plus and minuses. Thank you.
Well, I understand because the way that happens on national level, because not in every country the vaccine strategy is determined by regulatory authorities. There are more authorities in place, and that varies very much across Europe. But from a regulatory perspective, and I think the EMA the European Medicines Agency, was very polite because I was very sad when already decisions were made, 1 day or 2 days before the EMA came with their position. Because I don't think it was necessary to do that, but I'm not in that. I'm biased, of course. I'm a strong supporter of the European regulatory system, so I have that bias. I have to admit that, and I think it was not necessary. It was largely confusing also for the public. I don't hope we will have that again, and we all know that there's a lot of pressure and I understand why countries make their own decisions depending on the epidemic, depending on the availability and the supply chain or whatever. That's fair. But don't use then safety issues alone to argue in favor or against it.
Thank you very much. There is another question from the audience. What about a greater acceptance of real-world evidence for improving the labels and make them better aligned with the current clinical practice?
I like that question very much. And there is a lot of discussions over the last decade, and in particular now over the last 5-6 years on real-world evidence. I know that FDA and EMA and I think also quite a number of national competent authorities are working on that. In the safety space, real-world evidence have made a difference. When you talk about the non-steroidals or the oral contraceptives, even the gadolinium I just mentioned. So that has proven a real big role. When it comes to efficacy, it's much harder to come. I have not seen any product that proved just on only real-world data, and I always think that it will be a combination. And I hope that combination will be the future, where of course, you have randomized data for one part of the evidence building, but on top of that, the real world evidence to show, okay, in the target population and also in the population with all kinds of complexities and variation in prescribing, etc., it also has efficacy. So it's on top of it. And I know that there is a lot of investments also at the European level by IMI projects and companies. The FBI is working a lot of that, and I think that's good. But it needs much more than only say, well, it will be enough to change the label. I think it should be on top of it, unless you see such a difference, but I think that here the real-world evidence will be more useful to tailor the appropriate use, and that's great. That's very important. So it's not either. It's on top of it.
Thank you very much. There are some other questions, but maybe we should better move to the second part. So please, we will have time. There are other questions waiting for you. Other $1 million questions for you.
Okay. The next slide, please, Dan. Okay, a few final reflections, and what you see here is the title of a commentary I wrote a couple of years ago. That regulation is too important to leave it only to the regulators, and then what I've seen over the years that the good news is that the regulators opened the curtains over the last decades, and here I think AIFA did a wonderful job. I see that also with the European Medicines Agency, but many other authorities. But also that interaction with the clinic, with the patients, and with the pharmacist is key here. And I would like to highlight there in a few additional slides. So next slide, please. Coming back here to the whole issue about uncertainties. I don't think there will be any dossier, whether it's regulatory, HTA, without clinical uncertainties. And here, again, Rick Freeman from our group, he worked on together with Harvard Medical School on a paper where we looked at 33 pairs of medicines that were both regulated in the US and also in Europe. And we looked at what the FDA decision was there, and the EMA, and we looked also at the HTA. And as you know, for Europe, we used a basket of a number of HTA organizations across Europe. For the US, we used ICER. That's not a full equivalent, but you can compare it for the discussion here. And what you see here is that on the vertical axis, the number of uncertainties based on all kinds of categories, on safety, on endpoints, on strategy, population, et cetera. So what I would like to highlight, and I'll come also back to the question of Patricia, we should find ways to handle these uncertainties, and the uncertainties cannot always handled by more and better, maybe better, but not bigger trials, because that's something I think is a solution, and I should also not go for that, because at the end we should find ways how to deal with that, with all the complexities that go around that. Next slide, please. The second point I would like to make is, and that is also something where I know that AIFA is very active also in the European space, is a lot of part of the regulatory system have been developed and also have been part of the legislation for very good reasons, because we wanted to stimulate orphan drugs, we wanted to stimulate biosimilars, we wanted to stimulate advanced therapies or pharmacovigilance, etc. All of them have positive sides. You see that here in the second column. With the orphans, we see we had 0 in 2000, and now we have about 200. But on the flip side, we see pricing and monopolies. We see all kinds of struggles there, and how to deal with that. And that is now also under review in the pharmaceutical strategy. We see on the biosimilars a very intriguing phenomenon, in my view, is an impressive knowledge of gain of biologicals. Personally, I feel that some of the biosimilar companies know much more about the biological than the original company. But that has a price, at huge cost, and you see more and more also biosimilar companies that are struggling to survive, and it is a sustainable business model. And I think that's an issue we should discuss as well. Well, we already have discussed conditional approval, more on timely approvals, but there is a big but here on the uneasiness at the HTAs and payers. At the ATMPs, we see a very interesting phenomenon that more and more Europe is harmonized, but that's not in the rest of the world. And very often these are international developers, so how to deal with that. But also not on the national level when it comes to hospital exemption, GMP, GMOs, or genetic modification, etc. There's a lot of a big contrast between, and that's still upstream. So also upstream, we have not always convergence. So harmonization very strong on the European level, but not on the national level. Pharmacovigilance. I was a member of the Pharmacovigilance Working Party, so the predecessor of the PRAC, and I think it was wonderful to have this new legislation with timely risk management and a lot of other innovations. But a significant cost and sometimes also bureaucracy, not only at the regulators level, but also at the companies level. And at the end of the day, the question is justified. Does it really deliver in terms of better and safer medicine? And that's a question that's still very difficult to answer. So it's a real play in the context of regulatory science and also on downstream regulation, the benefit risk of these regulatory policies and systems. It is not always, in the control of regulators, because a lot of this is also under control of Brussels and other legal bodies, etc. But I think when the regulators are part of the discussion, they should be vocal also on to stress the balance sheet, because at the end of the day, the balance sheet is really enabling public health and stimulating patient care. Next slide, please. And we see that also here in the context of the European strategy, and I think many of you have seen this when it comes not only on innovation, but also affordability, when it comes to be prepared, but also a strong European voice in the world. And this is something where, for instance, when I was teaching here in the policy course, I was always giving my students the consultations, so the responses of different stakeholders, so the companies, the patient groups, the NGOs, the activists, etc. Because if you look at the consultations and also the concerns that are expressed, they give you a mirror of all the issues there. And I think these are some of these are very, very, very tough objectives, because if you want to stimulate innovation, you see that, for instance, now at the moment also on the patent waivers when it comes to the vaccines. That's not always easy to handle that in the same context when you also want to stimulate access, etc. So these are different political questions, but I hope that the regulatory science can also bring evidence to the table and not only political views, because at the end of the day, they also should work. The next slide. And that regulatory learning, I would like to be very strong on that, because I think that's a missed opportunity. And I'll just take one example of that. It's a paper from EMA colleagues just a few months ago, where they looked at IDRSCT and they looked at what kind of trials are running now when it comes to COVID. Very straightforward question. And what they found, is published in CPT, they found a lot of small trials, underpowered, bad designs, etc., etc., etc. If you signal that as a regulator, it's far beyond authorization. It's far beyond license. I think you have not only the scientific literature as done here by Hans-Georg Eichel and colleagues, but also regulators see so many dossiers not only in sequence but also in parallel, and when they can signal something that should be addressed in an appropriate way, I think they should do that. And the same we see now at the moment also with the vaccines, where you see parallel rolling out of the evaluation, but also learning across the dossiers. And that regulatory learning, in my view, is so far a missed opportunity for many of us. My final slide, please. Yes, there will be lessons learned from rolling review, crisis management, efficiency gains from post-COVID. There is no doubt about that. But regulation beyond product licensing, there are many opportunities, as already said, but there are also huge challenges, and I hope that this seminar also contributed to the thinking about that. Upstream involvement will bring many advantages, and I'm very positive about it. But as regulators, we should always be careful about regulatory capture. When you are too close to the companies or too close to the developers, and this is not negative for the companies, but I don't want to be too critical to the companies, but there should be always this independent. I think that's good for both parties. At the end of the day, it's also good for independent decision making. I see more downstream involvement puts a European system at risk, and we saw that with the vaccines, and we saw that also in the discussion. National interest may prevail, and I hope that we, I'm sure we will, the EMA and the system will survive COVID, but I'm sure there will be more COVIDs in the future. And that means also that when national interests are not managed in such a way that we have, and also a solid trust in what the European system delivers in terms of collaboration, work sharing, positions, etc., we are as European citizens in bad shape. And finally, that's my final word, investment in the regulatory science is needed also to bridge and to cement. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. There are many other questions for you. I just would like to comment briefly your idea that regulatory science should also stimulate innovation. I fully agree with you. This is a very important idea, according to me. And speaking of innovation, don't you believe that we should also try to innovate or at least adapt our regulatory approach, considering that the science is advancing and that the way to perform clinical trials and to collect evidence is changing? So maybe we should try to innovate our evaluation system. Don't you agree?
I completely agree with you on that, and I see that also happening. Maybe not enough yet, but it's there, and I think that is also part of the transition. Many regulatory authorities, both at the European level but also at the national level, have undergone over the last decades, where there is much more science brought in. It's beyond procedure. It's also very much also driven by the nature of new applications. You know, it's becoming more and more complex. So at the moment, you want to have a good dialogue with the companies on the other side of the table. Well, you should be prepared for complex dialogue and decisions. And you see more and more also that for instance, clinical guidelines, for instance, for arthritis, that was made more efficient based on pure knowledge input from the physicians and the patient groups, etc. You see it, for instance, with the use of test animals. You see that there is a lot of activity there to reuse that. Well, the push was maybe from the outside world, from the society, that they were critical on the use of these animals. But there was a very good response from many regulators, FDA, EMA, but also at the national level, to say, okay, if society wants us, we look for alternatives. We look for more streamlining. We look for more efficiency methods. We see the same with clinical trial methodologies, you know, because and also that is driven by some of the complexities of the product. You know, how to do randomized comparison with an agnostic indication. Wow, that's hard work. So we see in that evolution also more streamlining of the methodology that is used by the assessors and by the authorities.
Thank you very much. And about the lessons learned by the pandemic, we have two interesting questions for you. The first one is, what are the lessons that we may consider to prepare the global regulatory system for the next health crisis? It's a difficult question. I understand.
Yes, it's a crystal ball question, but just some reflections. Well, some people say, well, this whole idea about rolling review and a lot of efficiency in the way Europe reviewed, and not only Europe but also the rest of the world reviewed the vaccines. You know, that should be a model for the future. I think we should learn from there, but if there is an expense. You know, if I look at the MIB, and I'm sure it will also be at AIFA, a lot of authorities, prioritize this within their teams. So that means that there is no, there is always a price there because other duties that were not, given that attention that was necessary. So. And there is another intriguing question to me is that, yes, these were very efficient and the timelines were never seen before, unprecedented, with also speedy decision making. But the good news was the drugs, the vaccines were very efficacious. But let's assume we would have 4 vaccines and one would show 46% efficacy, one 52%, and one at 34, because that's what we see in oncology or, in another area. And then we would have very different discussions. Actually, this what we see here is the same what we saw with Hep C. Very efficacious product, and so it's indeed a strong push to innovate, but it's not heaven.
Thank you very much. There is another question related to pandemic. During pandemic, public wondered why a medicinal product, for instance, Pfizer vaccine, approved by FDA, had to undergo a similar parallel approval by EMA, and often looking at the same data set by a different regulatory body. And the question is how far the system is to a wider global approval process?
Yeah, in my presentation, I already referred to a lot of collaboration on the level of WHO, ICMA, IDA, etc., and that already delivered in terms of at least the requirements, and that was, I think, a very positive element in the whole process. And of course, there is more and more collaboration and dialogue and alignment, etc. But I think for a lot of reasons, I don't think that that an FDA decision will automatically be adopted by a European agency or vice versa, etc. And maybe that's also not necessary. I think there is already good news in terms of that they agree on some principles, that they agree on because all the vaccine developments are global, so that they don't care about the regions, etc. And of course they are targeted for maybe the wrong reasons, at least from a public health point of view, to the US and European markets. But at the end, it's good that the requirements are shared and that there is convergence and sometimes also reliance on these issues. And what you see here is that an interesting role is for the UK, of course, where the UK, not part again anymore from the European system, but with a lot of interactions now with Canada, Australia, and Singapore, etc. So it's a new world from that perspective, but also with a lot of collaboration between people who really want to innovate and want the best of patients and public health.
Thank you very much. There is another question, moving back to collection of evidence. In building evidence post-authorization, should healthcare professionals be trained to gather information to be used in regulatory activities and included in the label?
Well, I know that healthcare professionals in Italy, but also in the Netherlands, are very busy. So to put an extra burden on them, I would not be in favor of that. And they do a wonderful job, and as far as it goes. So I don't. But you have to think about, and that maybe not on an individual level, but on a group level, or with academic alignments, or with the associations, etc. Because a medicinal product is a half product at the moment. There is an authorization. The product is made in the clinic, because the doctors are using it, they see it, they adjust it, etc. And there is a lot of knowledge that's very often hidden and it's not seen. And as I said before, very often it's published in the medical literature and not always internationally, and very often it stays somewhere local. And that's a pity, because I think when a product is developed on a global level, also the knowledge sharing should be more on a global level, but not at the expense of an extra burden, because that's bad for everybody.
Thank you very much. Maybe we have abused enough of your time, and so thank you so much, Nicola.
No,
I leave you for the conclusion, and please.
Yeah, sure. I think it has been a very enjoyable 1 hour and full of in-depth reflection. I am tempted to one final question on your very nice slide 13, on which you were saying what is in the label, what is approved, and what do we do when the evidence is there but is not in the label? How do you see our improving and sharing reliable evidence that should be in the label but is not? How do we deal with that? As you know, off-label is a wide range, There's a part that is absolutely probably well-defined and evidence-based or evidence-informed, and some more variability that we probably don't like. And as you know, the arrangement of off-label use are extremely variable across Europe and across the globe, with the US and the Scandinavian and also the Netherlands much more liberal in accepting and probably identifying what is acceptable even outside the label. But as I found your presentation on slide 13 quite bright, maybe you could add some comment on where you think we should all go. Thanks.
Yeah, I think this is a key question also for the future of the label, and I think as a group like AIFA, but also other authorities, I think that you have a role and maybe also a responsibility to keep contact constantly with the medical communities about the label, because at the moment the label becomes some kind of an artificial legal document between the companies and the authorities. Then I think we lose a lot. And I know that in some countries you see that already physician organizations say, well, the label, that's not us, and, that's something from the industry and the regulators. We have our own guidelines and et cetera, et cetera. I'm very frustrated about that, because I think it's a missed opportunity for everybody. And that means that at the moment there is knowledge in practice, in the literature, etc. And I think that we should more and more flag that. And there is a strong reluctance. I remember one of the first meetings also in the Prague was about, I think it was about the safety issues in an off-label setting. And then the discussion was, should we look at this because it's a lot of label? Well, it's from a formal point of view, maybe that was a good position, but from a patient perspective, it was a little bit odd. So I think that if there is evidence and please flag it. But I know that also companies are very reluctant to move here, and I think it's that in my view should be part of the European strategy, because how can we tailor the label in such a way that it is. And there are maybe different models also, because now the SMPC is, it's rubber stamped and the discussion is there. But maybe you have different levels of evidence or different responsibilities, et cetera. And I know that some regulatory science groups are working on that on different boxes. Here is a box from a patient group, or here is a box from another group, et cetera. So my prayer is, don't forget the label, because if you get rid of the label, you never get it back again.
Thank you, Bert. I think this was a perfect conclusion to strengthen our role, and I truly appreciated your clear without doubt European perspective. Let's strengthen our European institution. Let's work more together, as has been in the spirit of your school and your wonderful academic environment, where I've been appreciating what you've done the last 20 years, and some of us have also come to your university. Thanks indeed. Hope we will have another opportunity, maybe in a larger debate, if we're going to organize a sort of a forum with other attending on some of the topic you suggested. Maybe this could be another way to stay in touch.
Very much appreciated.
Thank you very much for
Thanks again.
The conference and the availability for the discussion. And thank you very much again.
Okay. Thank you, Bert.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao. Ciao, ciao.